Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Tyler, and the focus is foreign policy success. The year is 1842, and Tyler, as president, has virtually no domestic agenda other than being at odds with the Whig-controlled Congress. So what about foreign policy? This is an area where Congress typically plays less of a role, maybe an opportunity to get some stuff done, and in fact, Tyler had some noteworthy successes in the foreign policy arena. It started out with a long simmering border dispute in the northeastern part of the country. The northern border of Maine, the southern border of Canada, this had been in dispute, frankly, since the ending of the Revolutionary War. The Treaty of Paris had tried to resolve, but there had been simmering disputes about this. In fact, there had even been some skirmishes late in the Martin Van Buren administration, and there was concern that that could even get worse. Well, both sides were ready, it seems like, to finally resolve this problem. They agreed to negotiate a new agreement in terms of this border, and it was a good notion that who the British put in charge. A man by the name of Alexander Baring, also known as Lord Ashburton, he had been actually spending much of his career on improving U.S. and British relations, so this was a really positive sign. Ashburton would be going up against Daniel Webster, the U.S. Secretary of State, in these negotiations, which would take place in the United States beginning in April of 1842 when the British arrived. And things got off to a good start. They agreed to have sort of much more informal kinds of discussions, meetings back and forth, rather than the more formal processes that are often followed in these treaty negotiations, where one side would write up a proposal, another side would have a written response. This was much more informal, and things at the national level were making good progress. The problem is the state of Maine. It was balking. It really didn't want to concede anything in this area, whereas the federal government had a little bit more interest in perhaps coming up with something that was mutually agreeable. Well, things were starting to break down, and at this critical juncture, that's where President John Tyler stepped in. According to his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, Tyler's involvement at this critical stage in the negotiation was an important catalyst to get things back on track, and sure enough, it did lead to a successful outcome. The United States got about 7,000 of the disputed square miles of territory. It was about 12,000 in all, so a little bit more of a majority going to the United States. And the two states in the United States that were affected, Maine and Massachusetts, each were going to get $125,000 from the federal government to compensate them for any of the pieces of land that they gave up in the dispute. Plus, there was a side agreement in this negotiation as well that Tyler was particularly proud of because it was in part his idea. Article 8, Britain and the United States agreed to continue their efforts to suppress the international slave trade, which had been ruled illegal but was still going on, particularly in the areas around the west coast of Africa. And both sides agreed that they would send their navies into the region to continue to try to suppress the international slave trade. Now, Tyler was pro-slavery in the United States, but the international slave trade had been declared illegal in the United States. Britain had been the leader in the entire world about trying to rid the world of slavery, and this was an area on the international slave trade they thought they could agree upon, and they did. Tyler was proud of that notion, and he was very proud of the deal that was struck that ended that border dispute between the northern part of the United States and the southern tip of Canada. The deal was called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which was typical of the time. The people who negotiate the treaty typically had their name associated with it. But Tyler felt it was a big success, and he was proud to claim that the piece of the country when I reached Washington on the 6th day of April 1841 was suspended by a thread. But we, Webster and he, converted that thread into a chain of sufficient strength to render that peace secure. Maybe he's overstating things a little bit, but still, this was a long simmering debate, and even though his name wasn't on it, Daniel Webster gave Tyler a lot of credit for his role, and Tyler was very proud of the accomplishment. The problem is nobody else seemed to want to give Tyler any credit. There was a dinner given for Lord Ashburton in New York just before he was leaving to go back to the Great Britain. And it was festive, and there were toasts going around, and when the toast for the Queen of England came along, there was a great ovation, and then the toast for President John Tyler of the United States was given, and there was, according to one report, quote, dead silence. Such was the life for the increasingly unpopular President of the United States, John Tyler, even in this foreign policy success. Well, other foreign policy issues, he had to head west, in fact, pretty far west. The first one on focus was called the Sandwich Islands, what we now know of as the Hawaiian Islands, right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Their sort of international status at this point was kind of unknown. None of the big Western powers had yet recognized the individual sovereignty of the Sandwich Islands as its own country. Some were interested in perhaps trying to annex or acquire the land. It was strategically located. It was particularly fertile in certain areas. But the Sandwich Islands didn't want to be acquired. They wanted to be recognized, and they wanted to have great trade with all the powers, but they wanted to be their own country. So the Hawaiian king sent a couple of diplomats. Tioteo, Haalilio, and William Richards were sent to the United States to negotiate, try to get recognition from the states, as well as perhaps have a trade treaty in place. From there, they were going to head to Europe and try to do the same thing. Well, those negotiations dragged on in the background for quite a while Daniel Webster was occupied with the British, but things got accelerated a bit when Tyler himself agreed to meet with those diplomats. Now, he was not ready to sign a treaty for a trade deal yet, but he did agree to recognize the Sandwich Islands as its own sovereign entity, and then he went a step further. Tyler was, like other U.S. presidents, worried about European intrigue in the North America, South America, that entire region. This was the premise of the Monroe Doctrine from back in the 1820s, which basically said, look, we'll stay out of Europe, you stay out of the Americas, North and South. Do not think about colonizing here anymore. Well, what John Tyler decided to do was to expand that zone. Not only the stricture of North and South America, but to include the Sandwich Islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He believed that they would now be off limits to any sense of colonization or annexation by the powers of Europe. He said that any such action could not but create dissatisfaction on the part of the United States at any attempt by another power, should such be threatened or feared, to take possession of the islands, colonize them, and subvert the native government. This was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. Some called it the Tyler Doctrine, and it was a bold statement, again, power of the United States continuing to grow here in the middle of the 19th century. Of course, the United States would eventually annex the Hawaiian Islands, but that would not take place for several decades. Foreign policy continues, looking even further to the west, all the way to China. Great Britain had been the first of the Western powers to open up trade deals with China relatively recently, and the United States, under John Tyler, wanted in on that action. Tyler was particularly anxious because the southern parts of the United States, his beloved South, had excess capacity and wanted to sell these goods. He thought this would be a great new set of markets for the United States. So he sent a commissioner. His friend Caleb Cushing was named as a recess appointment to be the U.S. commissioner to China. A four-ship flotilla got underway in August of 1843 to try to negotiate trade deals. And in fact, they were warmly received. And over the next several months, Cushing was able to negotiate trade deals very similar to the terms that the British got. In fact, got even better protections in certain cases. And by the time that deal was signed in July of 1844, he was excited to get back on those ships, head back home as fast as possible, because the Tyler administration was coming to an end, and he wanted to deliver that treaty in time. He did so, another proud moment and accomplishment of foreign policy under President John Tyler. There was one area where Tyler did fall short in these international negotiations, but this one was actually kind of by design. Great Britain not only wanted to settle the boundary dispute in the eastern part of the United States with Canada, but also there was a dispute on the western side. Great Britain and the United States had jointly occupied what was known as the Oregon Territory, based on a joint occupation treaty that dated back all the way to 1818. And Britain was interested in having something a little bit more formal and long-standing, as opposed to this treaty that had to be renewed every several years. Well, Tyler slowed this one down. He actually thought the migration patterns of the United States, of the Americans into the region, was already putting things in a place to put the Americans in a much better position of leverage for these negotiations. And he thought if they waited a couple of more years, that position of leverage would be even stronger. So Tyler reflected that I entered upon the negotiations over Oregon with reluctance, believing that under the Convention of Joint Occupation, we stood on the most favorable footing. Our population was already finding its way to the shores of the Pacific, and a few years would see an American settlement on the Columbia sufficiently strong to defend itself and to protect the rights of the United States to that territory. This would be a major campaign issue in the upcoming presidential campaign, eventually resolved by his successor, James Polk, mostly to the benefit of the United States, and a bit of a compromise, but still, Tyler's delay did accomplish his goal of giving Polk additional leverage in order to make his deal and bring that one to conclusion in the next administration. So for John Tyler, look, no domestic accomplishments really on his watch, but he did have some noteworthy accomplishments in foreign policy. But the most controversial and the biggest, that was yet to come, by the name of Texas. And that's the story for another day. That is John Tyler and foreign policy success from the life of John Tyler. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.